Just a little bit about my journey to grief, to grief support, grief work. I am a lady of many nations, many nationalities. I spent most of my childhood, I was born in England, but spent most of my childhood between Jamaica and St. Lucia. Came back over to England for the very first time as a young adult of 19, and found my way around. It was a very, very quick learning process to get through. I always felt people were interested, always studied people, tried to, I'd sit at a bus stop or a train station and I'd watch people and imagine, what they're doing, where they're going, based on how they dress, how they interact. And this eventually led me to take up a degree course in counseling and psychology. After which I went into volunteer work initially with victim support. Over two and a half years, I moved from working with general crime, victims of crime, to specializing with victims of domestic abuse. Victim support restructured and ended up centralizing their main office down to Clapham Junction. I chose not to go. I felt Croydon needed something. But without victim support, I didn't know really. I was at a loss. It just so happened that the applications to CRU's bereavement services opened up. And one of the things that I had picked up on when I was working with victim support was that there was a common thread. Almost every person that I dealt with had this element of unacknowledged grief that was coloring everything they did, the language that they used, and they were completely unaware of this. And it was something the supervisor and I constantly discussed, but we couldn't deal with it there. It wasn't under our mandate. So when the opportunity came to focus on grief, I grabbed it. And I've been with CRU's CRU's in Croydon, which is a branch of CRU's bereavement services, for nearly 6 years now. This now had its own set of frustrations. It's a charity. It is limited by funding, by resources, and this was reflected in the guidelines that we and policies that we operate under. We're limited to a certain amount of sessions per client and a very narrow focus on loss, on grief. And people are coming in over the years, especially the last 3 to 4 years, people have been coming in with more and more complex grief, which means that it's not just about the loss, the death of somebody, it's other elements of their life that are adding to this grief, this loss that is right at the forefront. But I couldn't deal with it, that we didn't have those kind of resources, and that isn't our mandate. So I came to the conclusion that I can do something on my own. I can step out and go private, which is what I did last year. It's a giant leap of faith, and set myself up in a private practice as a loss and bereavement counsellor. And I'm still with CRU's, and I'm still carrying the banner for grief work. I am advocating education on loss, on grief, on death, dying, and preparations for end of life through different voluntary platforms, because it's all in one great big package. And I think I'm kind of getting into a rhythm of sorts. So I welcome this great opportunity, this particular platform. Thanks again. And I shall do my best to give you a snapshot of what it is that grief is. And we all, as Mike said, we all suffer some losses. We suffer death immediately. When you mention grief, that's what people go to, the death of somebody. I like to broaden it, that we all suffer losses, life losses, along with death, that impact on us, probably sometimes as severely as a death of a loved one does, but it doesn't get the same recognition. So at every opportunity I get, I try to emphasize, it's not just about death. Loss is loss, however it comes, and any loss brings grief. And regardless of the type of loss, grief has the same process. So definition of grief is, it's a lasting sense of sorrow and sadness that's caused by a loss of some kind. It's a natural response to this loss, and grief can present in many different forms. There is no standard way to grieve. What will happen is a maelstrom of emotions that come as grief, as a part of the grief process. And for everybody, it's going to be different. It's going to present in a different way, and it's going to affect people differently, because we are all individuals, and each loss will be felt differently as well. So what may factor in is the circumstances of the loss, as well as your personal circumstances, the type of support that you have. If there's no support mechanism, then it may well be that the sense of isolation that comes as a part of grief, that would be more exaggerated. Your background and experience will contribute to how you, your life experience, will contribute to how you experience this period of grief, any particular grief, loss event, with the resulting grief. And when I say background and experience, I mean, culturally, we are, and I say we because I'm speaking from a BME background, and there is a particular leaning to deal with grief in a specific, with specific emotional events. And generally, most of you will recognize the words, big men don't cry, or men don't cry. If you cry and you're weak, if you show any form of weakness, then you're not a man, or you're not strong enough to live this life. And these are things that we hear them when we're small, even if they're not directed at us. We hear them when we're small. And I made reference to the culture in terms of the fact that I come from the Caribbean, and brought up in a Caribbean, West Indian household. This was something that was drilled into me constantly from everybody. This is the input that I was getting, and everybody that I've spoken to from that kind of background have consistently said, yes, this is what they know. This is how they were brought up as well. And it affects how we relate to ourselves. It affects how we understand ourselves. And I think one of the things we never get to acknowledge is the fact that we as human beings are all about emotions. So when we suppress our emotions, we are not being true to ourselves. And one of the things that grief should be is true to yourself, because it is such a raw, natural, instinctive reaction that it should reflect who you are as a person, as an individual. So as I said, most people think automatically of death, but when you don't acknowledge the other life losses, such as divorce, major things happen in your life, divorce or breakup of a relationship, lose your job, you have to move home, a home that you've been in probably since childhood or as a young person, things that you've invested yourself in, therefore your emotions in. It hurts. It hurts when the fact that you have to let go, that need to let go is bigger than the ability to hold on. And that's dictated by the event itself. That's out of your control. So that adds to your sense of loss. In fact, you have no control over any of these losses. It has to happen, and it has to happen in a way that you can't manage. And that's grief. That's the beginning of grief. So we should acknowledge, we need to acknowledge, because grief is a process that has to happen completely. Otherwise, it becomes unacknowledged grief that resides within you, that affects you, how you deal with events afterwards. It affects how you relate to situations and people for a very long time afterwards, if it's not dealt with properly. So grief is a process, as I've been saying, and that means that it takes you, there are a lot of elements that come together for it to manifest. Because a lot of as I've said, it is all about emotions. A lot of people try to avoid going through this process, go around it, and I laid out before what cultural influences can have here, but there's also the public element, in that the societal expectations are uneducated, and therefore their expectations are imposed upon us as to what they believe grief is and how we should behave, anybody should behave when they're grieving. But typically there are 5 states of grief, usually referred to as stages, but I emphasize the fact that they're states because they're emotion based, and therefore they're fluid. They come and they go, they interchange, they work together. So there's nothing formative about it. There's nothing rigid about it. And when all of this is coming at you, all of these emotions are coming at you, it's hard, it's overwhelming, it's frightening even, and it's easier to run away, much easier. The main 5 states that we see manifest are anger, denial, sadness, or depression, bargaining or negotiation, and acceptance. And these will come at any point in time, as I've said. So you may have somebody who's lost a loved one. Let's use death as the most common example. You'd have somebody who they've lost a loved one, and they're functioning immediately after. They go through the whole process of the funeral, and afterwards, they pick up the pieces of their life again, and they appear to start living. And that comes across as acceptance. And to some people, for some people, yes, they have accepted in the moment that they've lost this loved person, this part of their life, and they recognize they need to continue. So they continue. And because they're in this state of acceptance, when the rest of the emotions start to manifest, like the anger may come because they've come across a bill in this person's name. Let's say it was a partner, and they'll come across a bill in this person's name, and they suddenly realize, oh, they don't have this information, and they get angry, and nobody can understand, why are they angry, because you accepted it, the death happened so long ago. Why is it now that you're angry? But this is grief that is manifesting. This is grief that is fully coming forth now. And this is actually how it happens more so than immediately after, which is one expectation that's often expressed, because the person is not showing all of these expected displays of grief. Then everybody around them believes they're okay. That is very unfortunate, because this is a time when the person needs the support most. And this is a time when everybody has left, gone back to their lives, and just convince themselves that, yeah, this person is fine. They'll manage, they'll cope. They're not. They're not. One of the things that does happen, especially in a death, is there would be a sense of numbness, a feeling of numbness that kicks in. And this is almost like a defense mechanism that allows you to function, allows you to keep going on, allows you to prepare the funeral, make all of the arrangements, have the estate, if there is one, distributed, and go back to work the next week, which most employers seem to, expect to happen. And this numbness carries them through, and they're genuinely not feeling anything. But within that numbness, there is a build up that even the person probably doesn't recognize, until, like I said, they get angry. And they don't just get a little bit angry, they explode. It's out of proportion. It's not relating to the event that incited that anger. And then this poor person who is just about beginning to understand that they're still in grief, or they're beginning to grieve, they get ostracized, they get looked upon strangely, they get called overreacting, they get labeled as something that they're not, whereas what is happening really is something that should be recognized as natural, as acceptable, as understandable, as expected. So this numbness is part of the shock that comes with the knowledge, with the input of this death or of this loss event. But there's also guilt, and there's pain. And these, added to the 5 states that I mentioned, are all mixed in together. And as I said, they interchange. So there is no one way that grief will present itself in any person. And there is no one person that experiences different grief processes in the same way. So, common question is, how long does grief last? Well, loss is for life. You have a loss today. That loss carries on being a loss for the rest of your life. What may happen is that you absorb the loss, you accept the loss, or you work around the loss, so it loses its impact, it loses some measure of significance. And again, your body naturally defends itself. We are an organism that has its own defense mechanism. We don't control everything about our bodies. So one way that we protect ourselves, or this organism protects itself, is through the memory. So there are certain things we can forget, certain traumas we can forget, until there is an inciting event that would bring it back very sharply to life. And it doesn't have to be a trauma. It can just simply be that other events in your life override this particular loss event. So you carry on, and it seems as if you're over it, but you haven't actually grieved. You haven't acknowledged your loss. So therefore, it's not over. It just hasn't happened yet. There's a saying, grief will out. It could be years later. It could be, decades later. But grief does come forward. It does manifest itself at some point in time. So the answer to the question, how long does grief last, is it lasts for as long as you are living. It's just a matter of whether you're able to acknowledge it, whether you're in that position to acknowledge that this is grief for a particular event that you are feeling at any one point in time, or not. That's what makes the difference. When you've lost someone, that person doesn't come back. You've had somebody in your life, you've invested emotions, love, actions, activities. You've dedicated an area of your heart, say, to a particular person, and this person is gone. That part of your heart will forever hold memories of this person. That part of your life was shaped by your connection with this person, and that in essence shaped you, who you are today. Everything that happened before shapes who you are today. So there's no getting away from the fact that you had somebody in your life at some point in time, and that person is gone. They will be gone 10 years from now. They will be gone tomorrow. What will make the difference is the intensity of the feeling that you're having now, as opposed to 10 years. Because as time goes on, and this is where the very very much repeated phrase, but highly misinterpreted phrase comes in, as in time's a healer. Time itself doesn't heal you. Your memories, your grief process allows you to draw distance between the loss event and your today self, for want of a better phrase. So as time goes on, you manage to get an emotional distance from the feelings that the intensity of the feelings that you are having immediately after the loss, or when your grief process begins. And it's that too is a natural process. Kubler-Ross describes it as a dual process system, where you have two segments of your life, of your activities, call it. So you're going to have loss-oriented activities, and you're going to have recovery-oriented activities. And in the beginning, in the immediate aftermath of a loss, you're going to be mostly loss-oriented, but you need to keep living. So you will dip in and out of the recovery-oriented activities. What happens over time, and as your grief process develops, then you are less stuck within the loss-oriented activities. So you are growing, developing more, or incorporating, I should say, more of the recovery-oriented activities into your life, which helps you to grow distance from the element of, or the action, the event of loss. There comes a time when you're mostly in the recovery oriented activities. But every so often, and I'm sure a lot of you can relate to this, every so often you're going to hear a song, or you're going to smell a perfume, or you're going to have a meal or visit a place that will bring back a very sharp memory of a person that you shared it with who's no longer here, or a memory of something that's connected to loss, a personal loss, a life loss that you've had. And then you find yourself right back at the point emotionally, you'll be right back at the point where you suffered that loss. That's okay. That's a natural reaction. You will probably experience the same feelings that you had, or believe you're re-experiencing the feelings that you had at the beginning. The difference is they won't be as intense. And not only that, because you have now been so much longer in the recovery oriented element of your life, that distance will not keep you in the loss. You'll be able to go back into what is your main focus now. And that is how your life will progress. And this is why I can say quite easily, grief lasts forever, because from time to time, you will go back to your loss, because you have the memories, and you have that part of your life, as I said before, that belonged to that person, to that event. So it won't fade. It won't go away completely. So I want to give you some tips, I guess I call them, but also I think I want for you as an individual to recognize that it's not just tips, but it's also something that you need. You would be better if you accept this as part of an overall process. I think Mike's whole series of cafes has taken us along the path of self-awareness, of recognizing who we are, recognizing our needs, and some people consider this a big ask, in that you check in with yourself, that you keep yourself aware of what you are going through. And one of the things when I'm working with a client, one of the things that I say, to almost every client is that you be kind to yourself. One way of dealing with grief is just be kind to yourself. Begin with that process, because you need to be looked after, and you need to be aware of what your needs are so that you can be looked after. And if you start with being kind to yourself and accepting the fact that you're hurting, that you are in for some people a dark place, and for a period of time it will be a dark place. If you begin with that acceptance of where you are, I usually ask them to start in the mornings. Just give yourself some space in the morning to figure out where you are for today. Before you begin your activities, just settle within yourself, 5-10 minutes, and have that knowledge to carry you through the day, so that you can look after yourself, you can safeguard yourself, and you can be kind to yourself. So that's my number one tip, if I were to call it that. Acknowledge your loss is another. And when I say that, I mean not just about the fact that you've had a loss event. So you've had a breakup, you've lost your job, you've had to say goodbye to your children. They're going off to school, and that is something that's hard as parents to do. Or you've lost somebody to death. Acknowledge not just the fact that the event has happened, but what it means to you. And from day to day, it may mean something different. From day to day, there are different external influences that will impact on how you react to this, on how certain things in your life get highlighted. So acknowledge what your loss is. Maybe not on a moment by moment basis, that's a bit too much, but certainly develop that awareness of how you are reacting, beginning in the morning. So you're prepared, you're not caught off guard. And like I said, you're safeguarding yourself against the events of the day. You're protecting yourself. Not too much, as in you don't let anybody in, but so that you're not just open and vulnerable to any and every input. Because grief is it takes a lot out of you. It takes a lot of energy, it takes a lot of emotion, as I've said. And you will be exhausted a lot of the time. You will feel confused. You will not be able to concentrate very well, if at all. Simple things will be beyond you for a while. This is all natural. This happens with grief. With older people, when they suffer losses, unfortunately, they get diagnosed with dementia because they seem very confused. They seem not to be able to function. But really and truly, grief is a big part of this, because your mind went into shock for a while, and slowly, bit by bit, it will come back to you. But things that, like the memory of the person's face, that's very worrying to a lot of people. They lose this for a little while. They lose the memory of their voice. They lose memory of how to do daily events, daily tasks. And this happens no matter what age you are, quite frankly. But unfortunately for the older people, it does get put down a lot of the time to the onset of dementia or indicators of dementia. So be kind, be aware, and embrace the experience. It's going to happen. It needs to happen. It is natural for it to happen. So make room for it. Allow it to happen. Eat well. Sleep as best as you can. Sleep is another thing that suffers. So keep your nutrition levels up. Try and get some rest if you don't sleep. Try and make up for it during the day. Again, it comes down to looking after yourself, safeguarding yourself, being kind to yourself, treating yourself as if you are a precious commodity, because right now you are broken and you need time, you need help, you need a way forward. You need the strength to help you recover. So give in to the experience rather than fight it, but give in with strength, operate from a position of strength. Earlier in the week, Mike made reference to courage and working in courage, living in courage. And, I kind of had a smile to myself, because grief takes a lot of courage for people to get up every day and begin the day, begin their life anew, and face the fact that their life has been turned upside down. Nothing is the same. They are not the same, and they don't know who they are just yet. They haven't figured that out, because that is a part of the process. That takes tremendous courage. And, I applaud people who, once they recognize that this is what's happening, they step into it and work with it and allow it to be. More than anything else, understand that it's okay to not be okay. And if that happens day after day after day, let it be. It's where you are right now. And with your acceptance, it helps other people around you to accept this. You give people the permission in being okay with yourself, whatever state you present in. You give those people around you permission to deal with you as you are, rather than to come in with expectations, because you're giving them a blank wall. So that leads me now to how other people who want to offer support, how they can help. The first thing I would say to them is, well, it depends on their relationship, for one. That is a significant factor, the type of relationship you have with the person. How well you know them will determine how close you can get to them. So establish that base first for yourself. If you're looking to step forward to help somebody, make sure that you're aware of what the boundaries around your relationship are and work within those boundaries. If you're going to make an offer, follow it up. Most people may not be empty offers, but because it's not followed up, as in, call me if you can, call me when you need something, when when you're ready, I'll come. You're putting the onus on the other person. This person has suffered what is in effect a catastrophic onslaught of emotions and activities and tasks, and they're not coping, they're not thinking, they're not even hearing what you're saying. They have ceased to function to a great deal. What they're doing is really operating out of memory rather than out of conscious choice. So if you want to make an offer of help, be very specific about that offer. I'm coming over to cook dinner for you on Tuesday. What's your favorite meal? Don't know? Okay, I'll figure something out. And follow that up. After the funeral, call them, visit them. Don't assume that they're okay. This is probably the most lonely time for them. When the funeral is over, the wake has happened, and everybody who came visiting has gone back to their home, to their lives. This is when they recognize that their life is not the same. And this is when they start feeling the emptiness and the isolation. So call them. How can you now figure out what it is they need? Ask them. Ask them if it's okay for you to do this, if it's okay for you to do that. Don't just descend on them with a barrage of suggestions that suit you rather than them.
One of the things that I think I need some help on is recognizing that these 5 stages are fluid and they can come way later post the event.
Right.
How does someone identify that my behavior has become erratic, or let's use the word depressed or suppressed or strange? How do I identify that grief is causing this?
That's a very good question, because it usually appears to come from nowhere. Usually there's an inciting event, as in an anniversary, or there's been a trigger of some kind. And very often the clients that I work with, they're completely baffled. Why are they feeling like this? Their behavior changes and they don't like it and they can't figure it out. They feel the words have been used, I feel like I'm going crazy. And then what I do is just go back over events, recent events, what's been happening, what different has happened, what has come up. And usually it's down to an anniversary, be it the anniversary of the death, the anniversary of the birthday, the anniversary of the funeral. Generally speaking, it is around an anniversary that brings back this behavior. And where there has been trauma attached, identified or not, where there has been trauma attached, the same behavior that happened around the event will come back unconsciously or subconsciously. But it's not easy, and it does help that's why I emphasize, the self-awareness, check in with yourself on a daily basis, in the morning before anything else has a chance to influence how you behave. You check in with yourself, where you are at with yourself. And it helps a great deal.
Thank you, Fiona. I'm still just absorbing what you said, recognizing that we don't control everything about our body, and the body has our own self-defense system. So whether you have a faith, whether we expect you to be able to manage, whether we show leadership or not, there are some things that happen to us that seem totally out of our control. And I
Absolutely.
think what you said there was, we need to acknowledge it, we need to absorb it, accept it, or work around it, but recognize it. One of the other things you mentioned was unacknowledged grief.
Yeah.
It affects you in an unhealthy way. And this is Mental Health Week. And sometimes we are carrying this thing in us and we've suppressed it. And every time that subject comes up, we avoid it. But it doesn't go away. How do we start to embrace grief? How do we prepare our minds to say grief is okay?
That's a hard question.
You don't have to answer it. You don't have to answer it because I'm throwing it out. I'm just saying sometimes we're in that state where we know we need to embrace the thing that we're avoiding, but we still keep avoiding it because we know it's difficult. So let's open this up before I'll give you some time to think on that one, Fiona.
Yeah, thanks.
Remember, the grief affects any type of loss. It doesn't have to be someone who's passed away. It could be the loss of a job you loved. It could be a loss of in a relationship. It could be a loss, as you said, of your children going off to university for X amount of years or moving to another country. You've lost something. Can anyone in the room help expand this conversation, or maybe offer how you've managed grief, recognizing it is there for life? I like what Fiona said about the intensity of the feelings. They can diminish over time, but time itself is not a healer. There's some things that we have to do to manage those intense feelings. Let's open this up. Is there anyone who would like to say something? Just signal by putting your hand up in the blue hand up. There you go. Your side. You go ahead first, please. Managing grief, what it is, how does it happen to us? Is it part of our innate structures that we have, that, let's call it a God-given thing that we utilize to support ourselves? Fiona, you mentioned numbness, and it allows us to cope. It's like almost like a shock system, and it allows you to cope during that season, and like you say, prepare for things, be a bit resilient, and appear to be able to cope for that season. And then you mentioned, let's take an example of a funeral. Once the funeral's taken place, it's like the numbness goes and the whole door has been opened for all sorts of feelings.
Yeah.
Has anyone ever experienced that? And what did you do to manage? Is there some support you could give the room? Remember, just to add to that, remember Fiona said, grief is lifelong. The incident doesn't go away. It's how often it's replayed in your memory and the pain that's associated to it. It usually does dissipate over a period of time, but sometimes it does require you to be authentic and just recognize, this is my state. This is what I'm experiencing. I've asked that question open because I want you all to think about that and then offer your thoughts. but also to remember that some of us hold positions that almost doesn't permit us to show our humanity because we're helping others. Let's say you're a faith leader. It appears you've got to be strong all the time. So sometimes we defer our grief in a different way, and sometimes we don't go back and deal with it. And so we're functioning on our abilities and the things we've been trained to do, but yet there's a disconnect inside of us because grief is knocking at our door and saying, please allow me to just do what I do best. Fiona, you've got your hand up. Please go ahead.
Thank you. Yeah, I actually want to make special mention. This is a topic that an associate of mine who actually introduced me to your cafe. Her name's Debbie Roberts. She's a funeral celebrant with Serenity Gardens. And this is a topic that we come together about very often, as in people who work, employees, and people who are at the forefront. There is this expectation that once the funeral is over, okay, fine, you know, it's all done, it's all over with, go back to work. Work will help. You know, if you get yourself in that focus, that state, that position, then you just need to carry on. And there is absolutely no acknowledgement from the employers, from the people around them. In the faith world, oh dear me, from the flock, it's heartbreaking, the expectations that are placed on grievers, that they should just pick up the pieces. In fact, there aren't any pieces as far as people are concerned. And when it comes to people of faith, there is this misunderstanding that if you're a person of faith, then because you're in a relationship with God, then that means that he's going to take care of you, of everything, all your feelings, all your emotions, and you as a person, you don't have to have anything down here. It's all up there with God. So let's go, back to normal. No acknowledgement at all. And it's one of the things that it's horrendous, this weight, this burden that's placed on people at the forefront, as I said, employers, the policies that companies have for bereavement are practically non-existent. If they exist at all, they are totally unreasonable. So yeah, that's a subject very, very, strong with me and my associate, Debbie.
Well, thank you, Debbie. Debbie's also mentioned that you're doing a cafe on Saturday at 2 p.m. Could you explain a bit about that, Fiona, please?
Well, as part of the whole, we want people to we want people to accept death and dying and grief as normal. We want people to be in a position where talk about it over the dinner table, where that understanding that death is imminent, literally, for everybody. It's inescapable. It is a part of life. So one of the mechanisms we're using is the Death Cafe. It falls under the umbrella of deathcafe.com, which was initiated by John Underwood, who died 4 years ago, I think now. And it's based on a model that it's developed from a model he witnessed in Switzerland, where a sociologist was unhappy that there was not enough openness and authenticity around death and dying. And that model was brought over to England, to the UK. And there have since been 12,000, I think it was, at last count, death cafes around the UK, and I've lost count of how many globally. But it is a space, non-judgmental space, where people gather And we used to be in a physical space. Now we've had to move it to the virtual world. And it is pretty much a setting like here where you speak openly, you bring all questions, all concerns, and just have a discussion, a frank discussion around death, dying, and grief. Separately, I run a bereavement cafe, which is with a focus on grief, and that too has now been moved to the virtual world. I would prefer to know more about you and your process before, giving you such a direct answer. But I can say generally, I have heard from others the search for the meaning of the death. And my question is, well, who would it mean something to yourself or to the person who died? And if it's going to mean something to you, what are you going to do about it when you find this meaning? Why would that offer you comfort? So my response tends to actually give them more questions to answer, to actually help them figure out for themselves, really, why is it that they're searching for this? And is it an avoidance technique? And for some, it is. This constant search for meaning that they have no way of getting an answer to will definitely be a clear indicator of avoiding what's happening immediately, because it always keeps them out there reaching for something. But whether you what is key, I should say, what is key is pretty much in your words, as in it kept you away from the anger. What really needs to happen for you to be authentic, to be real with yourself, is if the emotion comes, let it happen, not move away from it, not find a way to be diverted from it. Let it happen and figure out why it's happening. And in acknowledging it, for one, that takes away a lot of the power. When you acknowledge it, you give yourself the opportunity to work through it rather than work around it. And that then will give you some meaning for yourself as to what not having the person in your life, what meaning that has for you, rather than the fact that they died. So you change the way you look at it. It's not so much the fact that they died, it's more the fact that they're not in your life anymore. Does that make sense? Okay, so what we want ideally, in an ideal world, when I say we, I'm talking Debbie and I and other like-minded people, is for, as I said, people to be open and normalize talk of death and dying and make preparations. So in that context, a good death would fall under the line of somebody who has spoken to their family about what their wishes are, what their end of life wishes are, if they're incapacitated, how they want to be looked after. The talk would also include elements of their death itself, as in if they are incapacitated in particular ways, prepare the family for this eventuality and how to respond, whether they want to remain on a machine or not, whether they want to be resuscitated or not. So there is some element of control that is given over what happens around your end of life. I have to say it doesn't always work out like that, but just the mere fact that you've been able to express this to your family, it creates a bonding, it creates unity of thought, it creates peace afterwards as well, for the family, that they have done as far as possible what it is that their loved one asked for, requested. A good death would also include talk around the funeral, what wishes there are, how they want to go, what kind of funeral they want, what music they want, do they want speeches or not? They may even write their own eulogy. That's something Debbie's particularly talented at as a celebrant. That's part of her work. But to box a good death and leave it at that, because it will mean different things for different people. Different elements will have significance differently to people. But overall, I think a good death is one, in my opinion, a good death is one that has been spoken about. And once you speak about it, you can shelve it. You've touched on the subject, you've opened up that door, you've allowed anybody, you've given permission to any and everybody to enter into that topic area, into that room that is you. And as I said, it encourages bonding. It shines a light on who you are as a person, because your death and your death and everything leading up to it will reflect you